Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate what a good turnout we have for the Governor's Conference on Energy and the Environment. We have a very good mix today of staff, employees from the Energy and Environment Cabinet, and people from the private sector. I encourage you all to network and get to meet each other. Thank you all for being here. I have, fortunately, I only have 5 minutes that I have to talk, so that we can get right into the meat of this. Today, we're going to start out and see if we can stir up a little bit of debate by having a legislative panel. And we are very fortunate today to have Renee Shaw from KET, who is used to grilling executive branch, people and legislators on Kentucky Tonight, and she's going to be doing that with us today. So she is going to introduce our first panel, of which I'm a member, so I guess I can just stay up here. Thank you. Appreciate you being here.
Gentlemen, if you would like to come up with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You can be seated. Thank you all for I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for the invitation to be here.
Thank you for coming and doing this for us.
Okay, so we talked with the legislators saying the temptation is to talk about pension, right? And as the timing would have it, we know that that's an important topic and people are curious, but we're going to stick to energy and the environment and go from there. So I do want to introduce the panel that we have. Of course, Secretary Charles Snavely is with us. We have Jared Carpenter, Senator, who is Chairman of the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy. Representative Jim Gooch, who's Chairman of the House Committee on Natural Resources and Energy. Tom Fitzgerald, Director of the Kentucky Resources Council, and Dave Atkinson, President and CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. Tom, do you still have on those same shoes? They look like the same ones you've been wearing for how many years now?
The legislative shoes are here.
The legislative shoes are here, so we appreciate all of you and the shoes. I do want to start with Mr. Secretary. Broad question about what are the issues that the Cabinet is facing and that you think you'll be dealing with in this upcoming 2018 session?
Well, there's a lot of, I'll divide them into external issues, Renee, and internal issues. And the external issues are, one is that a lot of utility representatives are here today, so we're involved in trying to figure out the permitting program for the disposal of coal combustion residuals. We're involved in litigation in that. Tom's involved in that, with us, and so that's one issue that I'm sure we'll be working on. Second one is that one that the Chamber and Mr. Atkinson is at the forefront of is water and wastewater infrastructure. This year we have a committee that is working on specifically wastewater issues. Last year it was water resources issues, when we formed the Water Resources Board. And so what we've been looking at is how do we do this for the long term? How do we fund water and wastewater infrastructure? How do we effect the proper management so that the utilities, the proper maintenance and upkeep of these systems is done well in the future? We've also are impacted by the implosion, I'll say, of the coal industry and the environmental risk that's created by all the bankruptcies that exist, especially in the eastern coal fields. But probably the thing that's right on our plate right now is internal, and that is how are we going to fund these agencies and fund our activities for the future, because we do have a number of agencies that are dependent on the general fund, and as we face all budget reductions and the future budget reductions, is how do we create efficiencies so that we can manage through that, and then when we reach the point that we can't make any more efficiency gains, is how do we create funding to fund the agencies.
Do you have any ideas on efficiency gains and getting the proper funding at this time? Are there any ideas that you can share at this particular point?
Well, let me just mention a couple of things that we've done that, and I'm going to, I told you we had quite a few of our employees here, and that I'm going to, hurt somebody's feelings by forgetting one because I'll go brain dead while I'm saying them. But I think we have found efficiencies in bringing the different agencies in our cabinet together. One is that we're all located in the same building now, save the State Nature Preserves Commission, which is a smaller agency. All of us are in the same building, so things just move faster. Information moves faster. We've been able to create efficiencies by working closer with the Public Service Commission, so that we've turned budget shortfalls into the ability to meet our budgets at the PSC by sharing services. We've done the same thing with the State Nature Preserves Commission and related activities, Wild Rivers Program and the Heritage Land Conservation Fund. By combining those things, we actually fixed budget holes, so that we've looked at things I think that have not been looked at in the past, but there will be a limit to how far we can go with that.
And many of us do anticipate that there could be some budget cuts even before we get to 2018 in the biennium. So are you prepared for that, and can you share any information about how you're proceeding in that direction?
Well, we have been working on that for the past couple of months, and I think that we're pretty close to achieving that as far as total number of people. I will say, though, that I think we're reaching the point where we have to make a decision on what service. We have to prioritize the services that we provide to the public, and I think in the future there will be certain things that we don't do that we do now.
I want to go now to Mr. Atkinson. Your legislative priorities for 2018 may resemble some of the ones that were undone from 2017, but talk to us about some of those priorities as it relates to water and wastewater energy, et cetera.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you, Secretary Snavely. It's great to be here with this group today. We are in the process of finalizing our legislative agenda for 2018. Matter of fact, my executive committee is out at Keeneland this afternoon and getting ready to go into a board meeting tomorrow morning, whereby they will approve what we have presented to them, we hope. One of the areas that is of great importance to us is infrastructure. We published a report, a strategic plan for the state in 2015. We admittedly did that in an effort to affect some of the dialogue around the governor's race at that time. We wanted to get certain issues out there. We call it 4 Pillars for Prosperity. You can look it up on our website if you're interested. But the 4 pillars were workforce, sustainable state government, infrastructure, and job creation. Infrastructure is a major issue for us, and that will be part of our legislative agenda. I think the two things that we've tried to contribute to this whole idea of having a 21st century infrastructure is to champion for 3 or 4 years, and finally got it passed in this last session, the P3 bill for public-private partnerships. And I think as it relates to wastewater and water systems, we're going to have to look more and more to private capital to build those and operate those. Because as you all know, probably better than I do, that the traditional sources of public dollars for that sort of infrastructure are pretty slim, if existent at all. So working with private developers, and I would assert that we have the most comprehensive, most transparent P3 law of any state in the nation. And there were concerns about when you put together a P3 bill to encourage public-private partnerships, how do you do that in a way where there's transparency for the taxpayer, there's ethical standards, you're not encouraging somebody, some county magistrate to go out and do business with his brother-in-law behind the curtain. But I'm really proud of what the legislature produced on the P3 law, so I think that's significant. Secondly, we published a report this year. I wish I'd brought a copy of it, but again, it's on our website, kychamber.com, an infrastructure report where we documented not just water and wastewater and roads and bridges, but airports, riverports, mass transit, broadband. We looked at looked at infrastructure from a dozen different angles and tried to get the best information we could find, some from sources in this room, and put it out there to say we've got a pretty significant load of projects that need to be done if we're going to be competitive in the future. And I'll make one last statement along that line, and that is that, and this is maybe too obvious to even mention, but if a company is considering expanding or coming to a community in Kentucky, infrastructure, any piece of infrastructure can be a deal killer. It's not a matter that, well, the flow in that pipeline's not quite enough for us, but we'll locate there anyhow. No, they go to the next town and they look somewhere else or the next state. So infrastructure is critically important if we're going to be creating jobs. So that's why we've emphasized it in our legislative agenda.
And what was the price tag that you put to all those infrastructure needs?
I think just on wastewater it was $6.2 billion.
6.2 billion
With a B. Mm-hmm. When I came back to Kentucky a few years ago at the invitation of the Kentucky I'm from Owensboro, but I was in Birmingham, Alabama at the chamber there for 6 years. They had a court-ordered wastewater rebuild. And when I left there, the price tag was up to $3.2 billion for that metropolitan area. And there were lawsuits and there were cost overruns and a few people went to prison, et cetera, et cetera. Matter of fact, I think the former mayor of Birmingham is a resident out here in Lexington at the federal facility. But $3.2 billion, so you can imagine what that did for rates. But statewide, I think wastewater alone, $6.2 billion. We did not try to get a total package dollar figure because some of that gets pretty squishy on assumptions, but just on wastewater, 6.2.
I want to go to the lawmakers to ask just on the wastewater $6.2 billion. Does that surprise you just for that one component? And how would that get paid for in such tight budgetary times?
It probably doesn't surprise me, and nor does it surprise Jim. You know, a lot of our conversations are talking about infrastructure and need for infrastructure. And once again, that P word that we sometimes are scared to mention, that pension that we all are facing now, that's a lot of the conversations about that is because if we don't do something about it, it's going to take any capital, any revenue that we have now that we could put back in this infrastructure to try to keep that funded. So that number doesn't surprise me, and I think we're going to continue to work with everybody in the agency to try to provide those services. Because with the job growth, you know, one of my most important things that I talk about in my community and when I'm across the state is job creation. The way we're going to make more revenue is by creating jobs. You can cut a lot, but you can't never cut enough. And I think the job creation and creating revenue is number one important piece of this entire puzzle, and that's kind of one of my focuses.
Representative Gooch?
Yeah, I think, as the Senator said, those numbers don't surprise me too much. I know I was a mayor of Providence 35 years ago, and one of the problems that we found then was that much of the infrastructure that we had was actually put in during WPA projects in the in the 30s, and the cities just don't have the money to do those now. So it's going to take some other types of I guess thinking outside the box to make that happen. But there's no question that right now the pension situation is very dire, and it's taking up the oxygen right now in the room. But we have to, if we can solve that problem, then I think that with public-private partnerships, bonding capacity of the state and the cities to do this, and we have to understand that these are investments, and we cannot not make investments that down the road will pay off in the form of growth and job creation and those sort of things. So we got to find the money somewhere.
Mr. Fitzgerald, your commentary on what you've heard so far and what your priorities would be for the 2018 session, given all that Kentucky faces in terms of pension and budgetary shortfalls.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with the panel here. I don't differ very much from where the Secretary was in terms of what the priorities are. I think it was Deputy Secretary Scott during the last Governor's Conference talked about, basically divided things into two pots. One was the legacy issues, and the question of we have old municipal landfills as well as other landfills that we've been capping and closing because the legislature, in its wisdom, created the Pride Fund, and it's funded in part by a tax on or an assessment on landfill garbage, which means that we're able to export part of that out of the state because we bring in some from border states. And so the question of how much, the pension in turn drives how much of the other dedicated funds are going to have to be reprogrammed in order to come up with an operating budget for the executive branch for the next 2 years, and as well as dealing with the legacy of not having funded the ARC going back many, many years that has now fallen in the laps of the current legislature and having to deal with this crisis that was many years in the making. So the question of how quickly we are able to deal with the capping and closing of the landfills and the operation and maintenance on the Superfund sites, because there's a lot of legacy sites where wastes were managed inadequately or poorly in the past. Then we have the generation of abandoned oil and gas wells, and the question, and we have a lot of forfeiture going on the margins within the oil and gas industry, because there's really been very little new permitting, and the development of the much more productive shale gases in the Marcellus and Utica shales has really put the Eastern Kentucky oil and gas market on the ropes, as well as the rest of the state. But so there's some forfeitures there. There's a concern on the part of the agency that we may need to raise the bonds. The question is that going to trigger more forfeitures? And then so you have a portion of that is not being funded, and there's some legacy costs there that end up falling on the state, falling on the landowner. So you got the legacy issues. We also have operating budget issues, and the pension certainly affects that, because it is more expensive to maintain your current employees now as the ARC is being required to be met. That is against the backdrop that during the previous administration, when the serial cuts were being made in the budgets, the protection of our air, land, and water was not considered a priority the way that education was. So the cuts disproportionately fell on the agencies that were not being shielded. And the agency, we are almost at the point, if we've not passed the point, where we are at risk of losing the ability to manage delegated programs, because we are not able to find any more efficiencies. And you're now looking at having to choose, do we fund forest nurseries, or do we fund this program? Does dam safety get slided so that we can meet our minimum requirements under the Clean Water Program? So it is not an easy time to try to juggle all those budgetary issues. In terms of substantive issues, we would hope to hear a strong push on the part of the legislature to support the Reclaim Act, which is Congressman Rogers' efforts to try to reprogram some of the AML money in order to encourage infrastructure development and encourage employment in the coal fields. That's a moral debt that we owe that region, and I think that's one that I would like to see strong support coming out of the Senate. We have the support in the House, but it's an important reprogramming. Of course, it's tied up in national politics with the western states that are paying into the fund and don't have the abandoned mine land. So it's a difficult issue, but I would hope to see the continued support of the General Assembly for having the Senate treat the Reclaim Act in a very positive way. As the Secretary mentioned, the coal combustion residuals issue may show up depending on where the litigation is. As the audience may or may not be aware, the federal coal combustion residual regulations were self-implementing. Kentucky had an existing permitting program for coal combustion residual landfills and chose to eliminate the advanced permitting program. We have sued over that. It's in court now, and it's fully briefed and waiting a decision. So I'm not sure if that will end up being taken up during this session. Net metering expansion, which Senator Carpenter was absolutely sterling on in terms of trying to get all the parties together to address the concerns of the utilities, as well as the concerns of this burgeoning new solar installation industry, which is providing significant employment, as well as some freedom and opportunity for landowners in terms of how they generate electricity and what their relationship is with the utilities. That conversation continues, and I'm hope beyond hope that we can come up with a positive way forward. But Senator Carpenter has been wonderful in terms of making sure everybody's voices are heard on that. The reauthorizations, there's certain funds and fees that need to be reauthorized. We don't have to, fortunately, deal with the hazardous waste fund, which is good until 2024. We don't have to deal with the underground storage tanks, which I'm sure Chairman Gooch is thrilled not to have that bill in committee again. It's good until 2021. We do have to look at the waste tire fund. And it was intended to help provide a bridge to industries that would positively benefit by using waste tires and bringing down the legacy of tire dumps that were out there, which are a public health and sometimes a fire hazard. And so I think one of the things that the committees will be looking at is is the program doing what it needs to do? Do we need to continue that funding, or has the problem gotten under control? The last issue, as far as I'm concerned, that really could stand some legislative scrutiny is the whole question of transparency of the municipal utilities that have given KU notice that they are exiting as customers, and they've created a Kentucky Municipal Utility, a multi-utility and multi-city corporate body to provide for their electricity needs. When we provided the opportunity for regional wastewater development some years ago. Built into that idea that communities could band together in order to meet wastewater needs in a regional way, there's a significant amount of public transparency and accountability. To the extent that we are going to see a bill, as was in last session, that would increase the authority of this municipal body, I think there's a question of transparency and accountability to the ratepayers in those cities, because now you have a utility that is 2 steps removed from any sort of public involvement, unlike the utilities that are accountable and answerable to the Public Service Commission. So I think that's a conversation that will need to be had. And that's, it's going to be a very difficult session. I do not envy them their job.
I don't think anyone does. And I want to hit the last point that Mr. Fitzgerald made about the transparency of the municipal utilities. Let's pick up there and then we'll work through his list. And I also want Mr. Secretary to get your feedback as well. Where do you all stand on that? And do you think that there will be some legislation either for or against that will be coming up in the 2018 session?
Well, I can't say if it's going to be for or against, but I think Tom was spot on that. And I shouldn't say it too often. His head gets too big if we brag on it too often.
I start to worry about whether I've taken the right position when anybody agrees with me.
Sure.
But honestly, like in Berea, for instance, I live in Berea, and so we have a Berea Municipal Utilities, and they're managed by our local utility board. And they've brought me in. I guess KMU is what the utility conglomerate they've started with the small local utilities. And so it's a big piece. They feel like they have the ability to go together and buy this power and offer their ratepayers a better deal, and it's more reliable for them. They do not want to be scrutinized to the PSC because they say that they have a governing body, which is their local city council, that does that. And so that becomes the conversation piece now that we're all having. I haven't heard about a piece of legislation that's being brought forward yet, and we would, but the conversation is very much starting, and they're wanting to do that. I know in Berea, for instance, they were buying power from KU. They're not buying it now, and they're trying to find out. I think they're in process now of trying to decide what they're going to do. So it's kind of scary because you want to make sure that you have a reliability for the customers of those cities, and so I think that's going to be a big part of it. But they think that the city council is their piece that creates that transparency, and so that's Tom. It's funny that he brought that up because that's going to be a big part of that topic.
Chairman Gooch, you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, as someone, as I said earlier, I was mayor of a city who did own our own electric distribution system, and I'm very much supportive of cities and counties and local governments being able to generate services, sell to their customers. There's economies of scales there because you can use the same pickup trucks, whether you're reading the meters or you're doing other things, and the billing. People come in to pay their bills. It's in one place. That money is kept locally. So I'm very much in favor of cities being able to provide services, whether it be electric services, cable services, water, sewer, those sort of things. And I think that, what happened before is you had these cities that were pretty much locked into one particular carrier. They felt like they were not being offered reasonable renewable rates and terms. And so there was strength in numbers, and they could go out then and say, well, we're not going to renew our contract. And so I think what this bill would do would allow these municipals to be able to kind of combine together and do some things that would help their individual cities. And we've already seen huge reduction in rates because of it, and we're projecting a huge reduction in rates into the future. And so I would like us to do everything we can to make sure that those municipals are able to, to buy and provide the lowest cost utilities to their customers. And when they do that, there's not as much need for transparency because, they're going to be paying a lot less. And those mayors and city council are elected by the people that they represent. And I think that ultimately is the accountability that's necessary to make sure that people are getting the services that they're paying for.
Mr. Secretary, does the cabinet have a position on this?
Well, I will say that we've taken part in the debate. We've talked to the municipals. I will say they've got some, Berea, Barberville, and Terry Nolte and Owensboro, they got really smart people working on the issue. The way I understand the issue to be framed, though, is that it's not as much do the municipals have the ability to join together and buy electricity, because they already have that right. In fact, they have already done so. They have changed their supplier. But the issue that they're framing is, do they have the right to join together and build generation and transmission and not be subject to the purview of the Public Service Commission? And I think that's a separate issue, and probably one that's not, it's not a today issue, because they don't really have intention of doing that today. But, so I don't know that I have I'm asking that question, is why should they not be, you know, they seem like a co-op to me. So I've asked that question, so I'm fine to say that. I've asked that question of the munis, is you seem to look a lot like a co-op, and so what's the difference? Mm-hmm. And but that's a different question than can they go out and buy electricity, because they can do that.
Yeah. Mr. Atkinson, you have anything to share on this front?
The chamber hasn't officially weighed in on the muni issue.
Okay. I do want to ask the lawmakers what their priorities would be for the 2018 session, other than just getting through the pension, which hopefully that will be taken care of before the session begins. But it will guide and govern a lot of what you are able to accomplish in the 2018 session. So, Senator Carpenter, what's your thoughts?
Well, Renee, as you well know, it's going to be a budgetary year, so this session is going to be consumed a lot with budget talks, and still it'll be, if we have a special session that gets completed with the pension, we're still going to have issues going on, I'm sure, with talks about pensions during that time. And I think Secretary Snavely, you know, last year we passed a bill, Jim and I did, through our respective bodies, that I think was helped with the efficiency and really changed a lot of the processes and procedures with the cabinet. And we spent time with them in the interim, and were able to help really make a difference. Bruce Scott, I know, was heavily involved with Haley and all the groups that really changed some of the regulations, like mine inspections. You know, we were wasting dollars, I think, on a depleted fund, having extra mine inspections that didn't need to be in place because you had, you know, duplication from the federal and state agencies. And so I think a lot of those types of things are going to be what we're engaged with. I think Secretary Snavely's done an outstanding job, honestly, of changing some things, because he brings the real world mindset of being in the industry to the agency. And I was with EPA Director Pruitt a couple of days ago here in Lexington, and it was the same type of energy. And I didn't get a chance to talk to him personally about it, but he kind of talked about making the agency more friendly to the consumer and to the business person, not being an adversary to those folks, not trying to find a way to make it harder on them to shut them down or slow down progress, but to work with them to say, hey, this is the things that we can do, and we want to help you do that. And I think Secretary Snavely and his folks at the cabinet now has changed, and that's a regulation change. That's an administration change. It has to be a mindset. And I know I've had this conversation with Charles, that he's had to do that with some folks, because that's what I wanted to ask the director of the EPA, Mr. Pruitt, that question of how you change mindsets that were with the former administration that were so negative, impacting on coal and on the waterways of the U.S., on the agriculture businesses. And now all of a sudden, just because the top leadership has changed and they have a more business-minded mentality, how do you get that guy that's going out and seeing folks change if he's still working with the agency? And so I think at the local level here in Kentucky, I think the Secretary has done an outstanding job with helping that, because I get phone calls from business owners and people out in the communities that are working that say, hey, it's a different time. 5 years ago when they come to see me, they were telling me they're writing me a fine, no ifs, ands, and buts, and this is their interpretation. And that's a scary word, that interpretation word. And now, we have a different mindset, and so I appreciate the cabinet for that. And we're going to work with them. I think net metering is another issue that's going to be important, and it almost blew up my phone last year as much as pensions is now, Secretary. And so I was glad to work with Fitz and those groups. And I think when we get a bill there, and I know Bill Representative Gooch is going to talk about that as well. When we get a bill drafted for that, I think it'll be a bill that'll be happy for everybody as best you can. You can't make everybody happy, I promise that, but I think it's going to be it'll be something that everybody can work with. And so, those are the priorities. I don't have any one issue, but I think reliability with our infrastructure is always a consideration and a worry with times of a budgetary crunch. And so specifically naming a bill, I can't do that, but I'm sure there'll be plenty that comes up. Renee.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Chairman Gooch, net metering, are you going to take the lead on this and tell us what
I think so. To me, net metering is something that's very much an issue, and it's something we need to look at. And part of the reason is that your intermittent sources for generating electricity, whether it be wind or solar, and those things have already got a way disproportionate share of federal dollars as far as investments, research, development, those sort of things. And so the taxpayers are actually paying for that. But what's happened with net metering is that the utilities have offered, in some instances, these smart meters to be put on your home or whatever, and then you could put rooftop solar, for instance, on your house, and if they were to charge you 10 cents a kilowatt hour for that electricity, then if you generated more than you needed, then you could sell that back to them, and they would give you exactly the same amount back that they were charging you on one end. And I think you have to understand that when they sell you when utilities sell you that kilowatt charge, there's a lot that goes into that. And it's not just the generation of that electricity, but it's the generation, it's the transmission, it's the sustainability of the grid, it's things like maintaining reliability, and all those sorts of things. So, only a portion of that is the actual generation. So when your rooftop solar generates that electricity, there is a cost and a value there of the generation, but it's not the same thing as selling it back. That shouldn't be a dollar for dollar thing. And so there has to be a difference, because what happens is if you don't do that, then in the individuals who cannot afford rooftop solar are actually subsidizing for the people that can, and that's certainly not fair. And those people, as taxpayers, are already paying huge amounts of subsidies to that industry anyway. So that's something we're going to look at and at least try to find some reasonable amount that, and it has to be something less. It can't be, if they sell you that cost, that for electricity for 10 cents a kilowatt, they can't pay you 10 cents back. It just doesn't work. It's not fair.
Fitz, I want to get your opinion about what Representative Gooch has proposed when it comes to net metering, and also the comment that he made about wind and solar getting their disproportionate amount of federal support, federal dollars. So I want you to comment on both of those things.
Well, the second issue first. The development of alternative energy and the development of advanced coal technologies both receive a significant amount of subsidy. And so we could look at dollar for dollar. Wind and solar in Kentucky doesn't get a tax credit. Burning Kentucky coal for electric generation does. So in the state, I think that there are opportunities for credits for renewable energy at a large scale, 1 meg and over, that were put in place years ago, because everyone recognizes, including Chairman Gooch, recognizes that having a robust and diverse portfolio of generation is extremely important. And the concern that he's expressed is one that I think others will share, is that we are in replacing an abject dependence on coal-fired generation with a dependence on gas-fired generation that raises other issues, and he's voiced them in the past about reliability and such. In terms of net metering, what I find remarkable in the debate, part of the problem comes in because the fixed charges of having you as a customer are not all on the fixed side. Part of it's on the volumetric side. And so the argument by the utilities is when you're using less, we're not recovering all of our fixed charges that we need to serve you as a customer. Now, that's no different than if I am more energy efficient and I'm not using a DSM program, I'm just doing it on my own, I'm going to be using less, but I'm not going to be discriminated against because of that. So the design issues for the rates is really what is at the heart of this. Also, what I see as being at the heart of this is that if the utility owns the solar array, all of the values that they claim cannot be quantified when we're talking about distributed generation suddenly come into sharp contrast. because the very arguments that the solar installers, the folks who have solar, the folks who want to do solar, whether they be a big company that's coming into the state and wants to do an array that's more than 30 kW, their argument is there is value to what we're doing. The utilities get summer peak power really cheap by having us generate it, because the very time that they need the peak power that they're either going to have to buy or turn on gas turbines to meet is when our solar arrays are spinning out this energy that's coming into the grid. But the companies have said, and where we really broke down last time, we said, let the PSC determine if there is a justification for a different value or for a different meter charge, looking at the cost of you being a customer and looking at the value you provide. And the company said, well, those values can't be quantified. But when you look at the filings that they did for the community solar arrays that they're proposing, the very values that the solar community is saying should be in the mix are justifications for the solar. So I guess the question is, do these values only become recognized when you're getting a rate of return on them? Or are they values that everybody who is attached to that grid are realizing because you have distributed solar customers? So it's going to be an interesting debate. And I think that when Senator Carpenter took the lead, he made sure that everybody had their voice and all the perspectives were heard. And I'm sure that Chairman Gooch will do the same thing if the primary focus of it shifts to the House.
I want to bring up EPA Director Mr. Pruitt, who made his visit here just a little while ago, as Senator Carpenter was talking about. And to Mr. Fitzgerald's point about creating a robust and diverse portfolio for energy, is that butting heads? Are those competing interests to look at alternative forms of energy and also the reality of where coal stands currently?
Renee, I think first of all, I'm going to sort of agree and sort of disagree with Tom, because I think first he said that we're talking about incentives, because we're incentivizing the construction of generation assets, right? And so I think that the incentive for coal mined in Kentucky doesn't exist anymore, so I don't believe that's there. The bigger issue is that in surrounding states where there are renewable portfolio standards, which in effect demand the construction of additional generation capacity that's not needed, because someone has to pay for that, and the fact that they have to run to generate their tax credits, and they have a lot of subsidy through tax credits. They have to run to generate those credits, so then therefore they sell electricity even at negative prices. So it creates a skew. But we could be here at 4 o'clock in the morning still debating that same issue, because the whole issue is, how do you value electricity and the different facets of electricity, of reliability, which is an issue that's come up with FERC now and in DOE, is that how do you value having energy storage on site? So how do you value resiliency and reliability? And so it goes more beyond how many cents per kilowatt hour is the fuel that you use to make the electricity. So there's not an easy solution. It is complicated by the fact that some states like ours are regulated monopolies. Cost of service based. This is how we price electricity in Kentucky. In other states, they're deregulated, so they price electricity differently than we do. And so our big issue is, how do we really, I go backwards. How much is my mom's electric bill? And work backwards from there. And how are we creating the policy that creates the lowest electricity prices? Because that's hugely important. The governor will be here tomorrow, and he's going to say that we want to be the manufacturing and engineering center of excellence in the United States. And the reason that we're such a huge manufacturing state is because we have the lowest industrial electricity prices east of the Mississippi. So there's great value in that. So that's therefore important for us. To me, net metering is a little tiny piece of what's a big issue, big policy issue.
Yes. Mr. Atkinson, when you agree that electricity has a large portion to do with that goal of Kentucky becoming a manufacturing epicenter of the nation?
Yes, I think the low rates and the central location of Kentucky are two beautiful assets for us to have. I'm from Owensboro originally, and the aluminum companies came in there several decades ago, in large part because of water transportation and inexpensive electricity. And they continue to be a major, major economic force. You know, we think in central Kentucky of our signature industries being bourbon and thoroughbreds and automotive. You talk to people in western Kentucky, aluminum is that important to them, and even down around Russellville, of course. So, yeah, that's something we have to protect as we think about regulations in our state, as we think about tax structures, the whole business environment, the judicial environment, how easy it is to get sued in Kentucky. Those are the types of things that create that business climate that makes or breaks our ability to compete. So all of those are very important to us.
Mr. Fitzgerald, the federal EPA's, you might call rollback of some of those regulations. Your thoughts on what that does to environmental quality, or your fears about what it may do to environmental quality?
Well, I think it was Margaret Mead who said you can't have a healthy economy without a healthy environment. And the thought that rolling back the Clean Power Plan, which is, the Clean Power Plan is not perfect. Okay? This was an effort using tools that were available when Congress failed to do its job. The House sent over a broad-based bill which would have helped to shore up the agricultural community because it used them to create credits and to lock carbon in place. It was really a very well thought out comprehensive bill. And so the Clean Power Plan was certainly not perfect, but the Supreme Court has recognized that CO2 is a pollutant that is to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And if Administrator Pruitt doesn't think the Clean Power Plan is the approach, it doesn't mean you just can ignore the issue. I've heard some concerns voiced by folks that were at a recent conference where they were talking about interstate air quality issues, and it seems that the new administration's approach to cooperative federalism is we're out of the picture and you states are on your own with no additional funding. That there is still a need for a federal presence because historically the states left to their own devices were incapable or unwilling to deal with very thorny pollution problems because they were afraid that the other states would lower the standards and they would lose an economic advantage. So the idea of a federal floor that prevents this sort of degradation is as vital now as it was 30, 40 years ago. The Congress set a goal of eliminating water pollution by 1985. We're a little bit behind on the schedule. And if we think we're going to attract and keep industries, as Dave said, one of the reasons that the smelters came was because availability of water supplies. We still have major problems in our waterways despite all of our efforts for all these years. And the idea of cutting back on standards, rolling back the MACT standards for the electric generation industry, it puts government way behind where business is, because business understands that you need a healthy environment to have a healthy workforce, to have a healthy economy.
And Mr. Atkinson, as someone who represents a lot of businesses in Kentucky, thousands, small and large, your thoughts about those rollbacks and environmental quality, and how is it also a business issue?
Right. We had problems with the Clean Power Plan. He mentioned it wasn't perfect. We did file an amicus brief there. We're interested in a clean environment, of course, healthy employees, but we feel like there are ways to accomplish that without that kind of sweeping change outside the legislative process. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves now that the new federal administration has taken a completely, 180 degree. And we want to be at the table, be a party to those discussions about how we can accomplish goals that we would all share in this room, but do it in a way that doesn't stifle economic growth. The estimate that we saw was that the compliance cost alone were about $33 billion. That's huge. That's huge. So that's what gets our attention and makes us concerned.
Representative Gooch?
Yeah, let me just say that there's no question that in the last 30 years, we've really seen great strides in the reduction of pollution. Probably about 85% from our power plants in the form of NOx and SOx and some of those types of things. But, you know, the Clean Air Act originally did give the EPA, as passed by Congress, the authority to regulate pollutants. We're talking about sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, soot, particulate matter, and those types of things that can be detrimental to human health. The EPA ruling pretty much said that the Supreme Court ruling said that if the EPA found that carbon dioxide was a pollutant and therefore harmful to human health, then it could regulate it under the Clean Air Act, which never intended for it to regulate carbon. But I think that the fallacy there was you had an EPA that was always going to determine that it was a pollutant to further the agenda that they had, and so I think that's a little bit of a problem there. And I'm glad to see that. One of the things that happened early on when we did have all those reductions with SOx and NOx and particulate matter and soot and all those types of things, it was because we passed some rules that actually allowed the technology to be developed to eliminate those things. And the problem with the Clean Power Plan was you tried to eliminate a problem and the technology just wasn't there. I mean, there wasn't the technology to reduce the amount of carbon from a coal-fired power plant that the law required. And so that was part of the real problem, was that, I don't have a problem if you let the technology develop, and if we even encourage and help and invest in the technology, then we can get to those goals. And I think we all want to make sure that we get to those goals. But some of the other things, though, that I do want to mention is that, the public out there has to understand some of the things that's happening out there, and often they don't, because much of the debate is just emotional. I mean, you hear someone talk about, well, we developed this new solar field over here, or we developed this new windmill, farm here, and that's going to provide electricity for 25,000 homes. And that sounds really good, but the reality is that those facilities will supply electricity for 25,000 homes 20% of the time. Now, we have a 24-hour day, and 20% of the time is about 4.5 to 5 hours a day. And I don't think anyone out there wants to say, well, these are the hours that I want to have electricity in my home. And so in order to use those intermittent sources without battery storage, and we don't have that yet, then what happens is we have to have backup generation in the form of baseload generation to make sure that we have that reliability and resilience there, and even affordability. You can actually flood the grid with wind or solar at a time that you really don't need it, times that are off peak. Well, when you do that, what's happening is the utilities are buying the wind and solar power. Well, they've got a coal plant or a nuclear plant or something sitting there designed to run at 85% to 90% of the time. And so because you're getting this other power, you're ratcheting that coal plant back to 60% or 50%, and it never was designed for that. It was designed to run at 85% or 90% of the time. And so, this older fleet that's not designed to run at half power, it even causes more problems with the reliability of the plant. So, we have to understand that, as Secretary mentioned, there really is a value of having a generator there designed to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that has a fuel source on site, so that for 30 days in advance, and we cannot lose track of that, how important that is, just because of the emotional arguments about because we want other sources of electricity. When we can use those sources when they work for us, we can use those sources when they're affordable. But we have to make sure that it's not economically feasible to use those sources just simply because we've got a backup sitting there running half capacity. We're still paying for it. And so that's something that I think the public needs to understand a little bit better. And they're not really getting that from the reporting and the people that are promoting whatever agenda they have.
Yeah, Mr. Fitzgerald, your response to that?
Well, I think that if you look at where the growth has been in terms of the electricity generation, the level of the cost of production and the penetration of the market of solar and wind has been nothing short of remarkable, and that is, it is competitive without subsidies in some markets. What's happened to coal, unfortunately, is that for many, many years, the significant amount of the costs of using coal for generation were off budget. They were being felt by the downwind populations, by the populations affected by the undermanagement of coal combustion waste. And over the years, those costs have been required more and more to be internalized. As they are internalized, it drives the cost up. Now, nobody can argue that coal has not been important to the industrial base and remains important to the industrial base. But as and regulatory costs have been part of the equation. You know, Clean Air Act, first phase of SO2 favored the Appalachian coal fields. The second phase, now that everyone's scrubbed, favors Western Kentucky because everyone is scrubbing, so you're going to burn whatever, you know, you're not concerned about the sulfur content. But the principal driver that has really upturned the energy market upside down has been the marriage of hydrofracking and of horizontal drilling. And the cost of, so now what you're looking at, when you're looking at base load to back up your intermittent sources of renewables, people are looking to natural gas more and more. And that is, there are issues that, and Chairman Gooch has identified, we've talked about them before, and they are serious issues. Issues of reliability, issues of affordability. You know, the folks that the council represents are in that intersection of poverty and pollution. And they are among the most vulnerable of the ratepayers. And so I am acutely aware that our decisions regarding our energy policy have to be very price sensitive. Because, you know, a half a cent a kilowatt hour change for me is not a big deal. Half a cent a kilowatt hour change for a smelter that does nothing but use electricity is a big deal. And so those affordability, and when we were looking years ago about encouraging the diversification of our utilities portfolios, we were looking at doing a renewable energy portfolio that would ramp up over time, and we were looking at doing a energy portfolio that would ramp up, mining out the other side of the meter in order to make the customers more efficient. And we had an off-ramp that we put, if it raises prices by X, you don't have to do it, because everybody is very sensitive to that. The reality is some of these renewables are actually becoming very cost competitive. And so the question is, do we stay with the utility model that has centralized generation and distribution, or are we going to see a reconfiguring of the grid so that you have more distributed generation, you have more on-site generation, the way that some of the major industrials now have with combined heat and power? It's a fascinating time, and these are weighty policies, and they will continue to be debated because they deserve the sort of scrutiny that they are getting, not only at the Public Service Commission, but in the public discussions in local governments and municipal communities, and certainly in the legislature.
Secretary Snavely.
Which specific question, Renee?
Well,
I have a few
Okay.
ideas that let me
I'll
put
let you
forth.
just go
First of
with
all, and because Tom mentioned this, and that is having, you know, it's good for us to have a diverse energy supply. We have that now. We have 1/3, and nationwide, 1/3 of our electricity is produced by coal, 1/3 of it's produced by natural gas, and 1/3 of it's produced by zero emissions type fuels, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar. What's wrong with that? That's pretty good, I think. It's very evenly distributed right now. And I also agree that from what Tom said, if the renewables are cost competitive without subsidies, well, let's just take the subsidies away. That would help me as an individual make a better decision, because I'm a free markets person, and it would be easier to understand if all this, the confusing part was stripped away, and I could see, because natural gas took a lot of market share from me. It's all about market share, because there's more capacity than we need. So natural gas took a lot of market share from coal, and that's, you know, there's no way, we can't fix that, and without policies that are not good for people. And then one other comment I had to make was that getting back to the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan was about eliminating coal-fired power. And it was because supposedly that carbon was a pollutant. Carbon dioxide was a pollutant. But the cost to benefit was not there because the improvement in the environment due to the reduction in CO2 was almost negligible. It was because that by shutting down all the coal-fired power plants, you also reduced more mercury, more SO2, more NOx, those things. That was where all the reported benefit was. So if you took that away and said, we're changing our energy mix, which is what the Clean Power Plan did, was to say, we want to produce electricity in a different manner because of CO2. There wasn't any cost to benefit to it, and that's why it was bad policy.
Representative Gooch, I don't think I gave you an opportunity to talk about some of your priorities that you have for the 2018 session. We went right to net metering and went on, but I want to return to some other ideas or bills that you may sponsor.
Well, I think we mentioned a couple of them already. They're probably trying to figure out this whole thing with the municipal owned utilities and whether or not they're able to, they can already, as the Secretary said, they can already go together and purchase electricity. And they probably could already go together and generate, build electric generation. But the problem was that if they do that, each of those cities would probably have to use their own bonding authority to be able to generate the capital to do that, and having this separate entity, might facilitate that a little bit. So that's certainly an issue. But I think that something that we have to continue to do, I think, is educate the public out there about these issues. And there's been a lot of people that have talked so much about carbon and how terrible it is. And the United States is probably the only country that met the Kyoto Protocol targets, just by doing some of the things that we're doing. But I think one of the things that we have to understand, and nobody's talking about this, there are about 7 billion people on this planet. 1.5 billion of them have absolutely no electricity at any time. And those people have a very tough life. They have a very low standard of living. I mean, they don't have, potable water. They don't have refrigeration for medicines and that sort of thing. They don't have factories to create jobs and none of those sort of things. So, and then we have another 3.5 billion people out there who only have access to electricity just part of the time. And every one of those people that have electricity the part of the time, they want the same lifestyle that we have because they've tasted a little bit and they felt it. They want, they want to have cars and jobs and air conditioning and all those types of things. And, we can talk about in the United States, but worldwide, the cheapest source of electricity is still coal-fired generation. And for these third world countries that want to improve the quality of lives of their people, we cannot deny them the lowest cost electricity out there. It's morally wrong for us to say, we've used this, this fossil fuel and built an economy that's envy of the world and a lifestyle that most of you would only dream to imagine, but you can't use that. We cannot morally do that, I don't think. And so we have to give them the technology that allows them to make it cleaner and that sort of thing, but we have to understand that the rest of the world would like a little bit of what we have. And one, as I said, there's nothing that's going to change the fact that for the world, coal-fired electric generation is the cheapest source of power. Now, in this country, you might argue that it's because of natural gas, but it's really because of the regulations, whether it be the MATS, the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards Rule, the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, the Clean Power Plan, all these, the ozone regulations, all these things combined made it impossible for utilities to make the investments, and so they opted for cheaper natural gas. So it's not just the fact that the natural gas is cheaper that's forcing the coal out, it's the regulations that made the utilities decide to go to natural gas instead of burning coal. And so just something that I want to
Mr. Fitzgerald, do you agree that it's not necessarily that natural gas is cheaper, but coal is still the coal-fired electric generation is still the cheapest form of power? Do you agree with that contention?
What was interesting when Secretary Snavely was talking about the national mix right now, the national mix had coal at 50% of the nation's generation not that long ago. It's now down to 33%. As I mentioned before, regulations are a driver. They are not the driver. They're not the primary driver. You could remove the regulations completely, which of course would be absolutely irresponsible. You're still not going to bring back the Appalachian coal industry. I thought it was somewhat ironic that almost the day after the election, the ranking senator from Kentucky was asked whether those jobs would be coming back now that President Trump was in office. He said, well, that's a matter for the private markets. We have no role to play in that. I'm like, really? After 8 years of trumpeting this so-called war on coal, suddenly you have no role to play in that? I think that was pretty telling. I think that the regulatory drivers certainly drive up the cost. Natural gas has a lighter footprint in terms of particulate pollution, in terms of CO2 emissions. And so if you are requiring people to account for that pollution rather than shifting it downwind, it's going to put coal at a disadvantage. The alternative is the alternative when you look at the Clean Power Plan. I do have to differ. Anytime you're doing a regulatory program where you're looking at controlling pollutants at the source, you're looking for what they call a twofers or threefers. If I can control this pollutant, is it also going to provide other health benefits? Because the failure to do so means that somebody is getting asthma, somebody's asthma is getting worse, somebody's dying of pulmonary or respiratory distress, and somebody's not going to work and not being productive and not helping your economy. There was a significant amount of benefit in terms of fine particulate pollution from the Clean Power Plan. Now, as I said, it wasn't perfect. I think there were some procedural issues, and the fact that it wasn't perfect is probably the reason that the Supreme Court issued a stay of those regulations, which is a very rare thing. You don't usually, the Supreme Court usually let the lower courts play out, but in this case they issued a stay because there were some procedural issues that make it a very close call. Substantively, I think the science is impeccable. Carbon dioxide is contributing to abrupt changes in the climate, and I think if you look at the severity of storm events that are directly related to an unstable climate, I don't think that any credible scientist is going to be able to tell you that, no, this is not a problem that needs to be addressed. How you address it? Because the easiest thing to do is the sort of thing that the past legislatures did with the pension crisis, is to kick it down the road. Because you making a hard decision now that's going to protect future generations, they're not voting. And so it is a very difficult thing to come to terms with those issues. But it's time that we do. And doing it in a way that's going to protect our consumers, protect our ratepayers, is going to provide the sort of opportunity, as Chairman Gucci is absolutely right. If you're setting a target for reducing pollution, you have to allow a reasonable time for the technology to respond to it. And to do otherwise I think, is not responsible. So even before we got to the Clean Power Plan, the new source performance standards that were done were indicating that there was no real cost because coal wasn't going to be building any new plants anyway. That's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're not going to investors are not going to invest in new technology on the assumption that 10 or 20 years from now we can retrofit it. That's just not the sort of investment you're going to do in an asset that's going to be around for 50 years. So they're complex issues. We would differ in terms of which driver was more important. I think that the hydrofracking was, and horizontal drilling really kicked the feet out of the coal market in a way, and the cost of production of Appalachian coal relative to Powder River Basin. I mean, it's a kind of a perfect storm of adverse economic impacts on the industry that have caused it to decline significantly. It'll continue to be a niche market, but the cost of production is much higher than it is, even if you take the regulatory drivers away.
Chairman
Renee,
Carpenter, if I can get Chairman Carpenter, he's been a little quiet, and then we'll go back to you, Chairman
I'm just
Gooch.
listening.
Listening and learning, right? Do you believe that the steps that have been taken on the federal level, federal government level, are easing up that war on coal, and that coal will return in some way that we had heard was going to be promised on the campaign trail just a year ago?
I think regulation has definitely stifled the ability to produce coal. And Tom made a comment, said that he didn't think that regulations changed the production of coal, and he thought it was going to shift anyways, and it was shifting anyways. But once they created a regulation that really made it hard for coal production and for you to make it feasible, and it has to make money. If it doesn't make economic sense, it's not going to make sense for the business or for the consumer. And so once fracking become more of a storefront name that people knew and understood, it did make the cost of natural gas much more efficient or much more cost effective. And so that's what made a difference. But the reason that people started looking at gas for that was because the regulations were stifling the coal industry. I don't know if the coal industry can come back to ever what it was, and I don't think it will, because typically, I'm doing a development right now. In my real life or my personal life, I'm in the development and building business. And when you have a development that's going really good, as long as it's continuing, you're selling houses and people are coming in, or if you got a rental real estate, people are coming in, the market kind of drives itself. But if you shut that market off and you close that area down, to build it back, it takes a long amount of time. And that's kind of what's happened to coal. And I don't think that we're going to be able to build it back to nothing like it is now, until something shifts with let's say, the natural gas market. And who says that something doesn't shift with that market? And reliability is always a major concern. When I first took this position and I toured coal facilities, and I didn't really, I'm a guy that flipped my light switch on or whatever, and you assume it's there. But when you started realizing that the reliability of coal was so important because they had that stockpile on the yard of the power plant, you realize, hey man, if something happens downstream or on a transmission line with gas, they don't have that reliability. So what's there? So personally, I've always said diversification is important. I think we need to continue to support coal. That's made the economy what it is in Kentucky. My community I live in, the reason that our industrial base is so good is because of the manufacturing businesses here. The reason manufacturing has come to my area and Kentucky was because of the affordable energy cost. Why was energy affordable? It was because of the production of coal. And so I think to say that we're just going to push that to the side and say that's not a big player in our economy would be crazy for us. But to also understand that natural gas is having to play a part in that is part of it. And I think Secretary Snavely said that. I mean, he said we have diversification now, and what's wrong with that? And then we're going to continue that diversification. But to say that you're going to cut out one part of the market, there's no way you can do it. And that's what my comments were when we talked about net metering. There was an opportunity for solar systems, and there still is, and that industry is changing because of the engineering and the technology. And at one time in Berea, I use Berea as a reference because people were buying solar panels there, and one panel would cost you about $600. It saved you $20 a year. So the return on your investment was not much. I mean, it's basically zero. But the emotional content of that, like Representative Gooch said, people bought into that. But now the technology is changing to where that return is getting better. So should we have said no, solar's never going to have a player in it because 10 years ago there wasn't a way to store the system and solar panels wasn't affordable? No. And so I think that to say that we're just going to continue to diversify and have our minds open and understand what our past was that made us where we are and look at the future. And coal is going to has played a part in that in the past, and I think it'll continue to play a part in the future.
Chairman Gooch, didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought beforehand,
Right.
and then.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr.
Well, I think Tom did mention one thing that I think is important to realize that, and he mentioned the clean power plant and the reductions of carbon at the source, at the power plant. All the prior EPA regulations were actually aimed at the source, inside the fence, but with the clean power plant, much of it was actually outside the fence, so it was regulated a lot more than just at the source, and so that was a major difference as well. But let me just say, as far as Senator Carpenter's comments, I don't think coal will ever come back to the way it was, but I think we have to understand that 40 years ago, it was actually illegal in this country to use natural gas to generate electricity after the Carter administration. And so what happened is natural gas is a great fuel. I use it to heat my home. We need to be using it more and more for transportation fuels and that sort of thing, running our businesses and all of that. But I think that if you look at the shale situation now, as Tom said earlier, our dry gas industry in East Kentucky is pretty much shut down because they really can't drill and get the gas for the price that it is now. And I think that what happens is over time, as we're starting to export more and more liquefied natural gas and export it, the price very well may come up. And it wouldn't take a lot more for coal to be competitive if that natural gas prices does come up. And the other thing too is, as Senator Carpenter mentioned, the reliability issue. Even with natural gas facilities, you're hooking up a power plant to a natural gas pipeline that has a constant flow of natural gas through that pipeline. But if there's ever a situation where there's a disruption in that flow of natural gas, or there's more demand than what that pipeline has capacity for, someone's not going to have fuel to generate electricity. And so those are the kind of things that could make a difference, but we will never see coal mining, especially in Appalachia, back to where it once was.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
Well, I think the one thing we could agree on is no one can foresee what this picture is going to be in 10 years. Nobody 10 years ago, I've taught energy law since the late 80s I'm a lowly adjunct in my other life over at the Brandeis School.
Those shoes were new back then.
They were new
Right.
back then, right?
And I would dust off my notes and go in and talk about coal being 50% of the nation's mix, nuclear being 20, and nobody foresaw that you would combine horizontal drilling and hydrofracking and find the sort of reserve that you did in what were thought to be tight shale formations that simply were not going to be able to produce. Who's to say that 5-10 years from now, even sooner, that we discover, Elon Musk and others are putting a lot of money, and we are putting some money in Kentucky into batteries. Battery storage, as Chairman Gooch said, that really is the nut that needs to be cracked in order for solar to be stored and to be used in a less intermittent manner. You also have sequestration geologically is not feasible. The cost of scrubbing using MEA or some other solvent to scrub CO2 from existing plants and then to try to compress and sequester it is simply not feasible and makes that power uneconomic. Who's to say that the research that's being done on chemical sequestration or other forms is not going to provide a new lease on life for this fleet of plants that are out there that are mostly fully depreciated and are providing cheap power because all we're paying is operation and maintenance on it, as well as some of the retrofitting. So it's really hard to tell, but I think that underlying it all is that we try to be as prudent as we can. We try to look at the facts. We try to look at what best protects the ratepayers, whether we're sending the right signals to the utilities in terms of their investments, and how to align their interests with the interests of their customers and having inexpensive, reliable power. One thing that is interesting, though, is solar and other renewables in a properly structured environment have the opportunity to extend the life of the coal-fired fleet. Because if they can be part of the mix and offset the carbon the same way that using greater efficiency on the other side of the meter makes that kilowatt hour that you're generating go further, then you can help extend by lowering the overall carbon intensity. And that's something that, as Chairman Gooch mentioned, that was something that the Clean Power Plan tried to do. The question is that the best system of emissions reductions, or is that beyond what Congress intended because you're going on the other side of the meter? So that's one of the questions that was an interesting question, but it's one that has a lot of, it has a lot of potential impact. And I think it had a lot of potential benefit because of the fine particulate reduction. But now the EPA, current EPA, has kind of has cooked the economic and the benefits analysis a little bit, and they're ignoring those benefits that would have been derived. But it'll be an interesting process as they try to unwind it, because the endangerment finding has been made and carbon has to be addressed.
Mr. Atkinson.
I might get into dangerous territory here, but I'd like to offer more of a political observation, and that is that I think in the last decade or so, the discussion of coal in Kentucky and nationwide has been subjected to kind of a simplistic political equation. Are you for coal or against coal? You read a newspaper column that wants to put all of us in one camp or the other. And we all know that our society right now is polarized in terms of its politics. You had Obama here in a major swing. Most of us have whiplash with the new political environment in the nation and in Kentucky too. And coal has been, to some extent, a victim of that same kind of polarization. Truth of the matter is, I think we're going to be living with coal. Kentucky is fueled by coal still, and we will for the rest of our lives, most of the people in this room. And so I think the thoughtful discussion that takes place in a forum like this and with an audience like this, a group like this has the ability to get into the nuance of that. I think we would all agree that we don't want an aluminum smelter to leave Western Kentucky because of power rates. We don't want to lose the competition for Toyota to make the Lexus in Kentucky because some other state had better rates, and that was one of the drivers of Toyota's decision. So I think there are things we can all agree on, including a clean environment, and it's this kind of discussion that will help us get past that overly simplistic, are you for it or against it, as though we're going to flip a switch tomorrow and go one way or the other.
Good perspective.
Well put.
Mr. Secretary, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. Two things. I think with regards to both what the internal issues that we're facing in the cabinet and what we're facing with environmental cleanups and infrastructure and with energy, never underestimate the ingenuity of people. Because to go back to the first thing Tom said about our ability, although I appreciate Jared being complimentary of me, this cabinet and a lot of the people in this room going back years have been done very smart management and very good people that have been able to protect public health and safety even with the reduction in their budget over the years. And so will we be able to keep doing that in the future? We'll be able to do some because there's a lot of really good people here. So never underestimate the ingenuity of people. And the second thing is, don't try to predict the future.
Amen.
Good words to end on. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank
Give them a
you.
round of applause for their commentary.
Okay, John, is the break next? So are you ready to show? We're getting ready to take a break, but I've had a request from the governor, and I work for the governor, so I usually pay attention to those requests. And he has asked us to view a short video. So we've got like a 2-minute video I'd like for y'all to see. And after that, then feel free to get up and take your break. And thank you all. I really appreciate y'all being here. I thought it was a good discussion. We didn't solve the world's problems, but at least we talked about them. All right. Are we done? Thank you.